Okay, well, welcome everybody. We are here for our next session with the Institute, focusing on organizational priorities. And so I'm going to introduce our faculty, our astounding faculty members for this session. First is Chris Silva, Chris is the Director of Housing at American University. And prior to American, Chris worked at the University of Denver, Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar, University of Nebraska, and Utah State University. Chris has worked with sustainability programs, guest services, fraternity and sorority life, student activities, service learning, and online and distance education. Chris is a native of Brazil, and having lived most of his life abroad, also calls home the USA and Qatar. Chris received his bachelor's degree from Utah State University in International Studies, master's degrees, plural, from University of Nebraska in counseling and Harvard University in environmental management, and has a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of Denver. And we welcome Chris. Jude Kaya, you're going to have to write all this down to try to keep up, has 3 bachelor's degrees, two from SUNY Potsdam in political science and secondary social science education, and a bachelor's in business from Western Illinois University, 2 master's degrees, one from SUNY Potsdam in social science, and a master's of business administration and finance from Western Illinois University, and a PhD in business administration from North Central University. Jude has worked at SUNY Potsdam, Savannah College of Art and Design, Western Illinois University, Xavier University, and is currently at Texas Christian University, where he's currently serving as the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. Over his tenure, Jude has held positions in university relations, athletics, residence life, student union, auxiliary services, divisional business officer, contracts, strategic planning, and revenue generation. So please give a warm welcome to Chris and Jude.
So we're gonna tag team, and we're gonna try to let you all, much like our esteemed colleague Leonard did, we're gonna do something very similar to try to keep you engaged during this. I was in the last session, listened to most of it. You may find some of it to give you a little further into the same kinds of thought processes. So I think we're well positioned, Chris. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, excited to be here. Great to connect and talk to everyone here and in other sessions. So let's get started. So what are we going to do today, right? We're going to talk about this concept of organization priorities and help you understand where you can find them, how you can learn about them, and then how you connect that with how your unit, your team supports those, right? Helping you recognize, observe that housing and residence life, right, campus living supports various needs, very diverse needs of the student experience. And sometimes those priorities are not exactly maybe always said perfectly the way that you may expect, but how then your role fits into that? How does the campus living experience fits into the larger role of the university experience? And then looking into how you use this position, how you use your mid-level role to advance the organizational priorities of the institution, and how you make sure that you continue to be relevant as a professional, as well as a unit. We will make sure that we touch on how the impact of COVID-19 has, of course, thrown a wrench into organizational priorities, and we're going to focus on student staff well-being as we go through this. So just wanted to make sure that as we go through, this is our roadmap for this conversation today. All right. So why should you care? Why should you care about organizational priorities? Why are they important, right? Well, they help you understand your alignment and relevance, right? Is the work that you do aligned with the universities, the institutions, vision, mission, strategic planning. And in doing that, ensuring that you as a professional and the unit and the teams that you work with are relevant, right? The opposite of that, you can think of that if you're not relevant or if you're not aligned, you are a issue, a problem to the institution. And you will learn, if you perhaps you have already, how lack of alignment could be a concern. And so it's very, very important to understand and to care about organizational priorities. It's also important that you know this as you know the roadmap and the expectations of your institution, of your division, as you know the priorities. It'll also help you, we hope, relieve and reduce in stress, anxiety of perhaps not knowing what of some of this some unknown expectation that you may have. Perhaps it's from hearsay from others, or perhaps it's just your perspective. Because as you learn priorities, as you understand what they are, it can help you clarify if this is the place for you, if you are aligned, if your teams are clear, or not, and then help you make best decisions to address and to adjust and to move forward. And as you do that, becoming not only a good and improving to be a greater student housing professional, but also moving you along in that thought process of, okay, I have individuals that I work with, I work very closely to students, and I do this because my university's goals and targets and objectives direct me to do this. And as we do it, I am aligned. As we were saying, we're going to talk about COVID, but COVID threw a wrench into the process because it bypassed traditional processes for organizational planning, strategic planning, long-range planning, and will continue to impact not just this year and even next year, but they bypassed and became the focal point and the new organization priority this past year to, I would say, to all the universities, not just in the US, but across the world. And so understanding how an issue, a problem, or a new priority could bypass it, typical efforts, and become that element. And so it's important to care about those and to understand that one feature of a developing student housing professional, mid-level, senior level, is to be nimble and to help their teams understand how priorities may adjust and may change.
Hey, Chris, all right, so I would add to that this. One of the things I liked the best about when I was in the halls was it felt like it was my own little community. It was sort of separated from everything else. You could eat there, you go to the computer center, you could work out there. I mean, it was essentially its own place. And for all the world, it really didn't seem to touch me so much about what the true organizational priorities were. I knew my priorities were to open the doors, close the doors, make people safe, keep problems to a minimum, build community. I mean, those were just daily things. And I think when you move to that, I call it the North Star. When you move to that mid-level, you begin to move closer to the organizational sense of what everybody is supposed to be doing. And you now are exposed to having to advocate and also to communicate those priorities. Obviously knowing what they are to begin with is, and being part of that conversation is a big thing. And knowing where I said the North Star is, I think is one of the things that mid-level people struggle with, because it really wasn't part of it. We're very focused on our learning objectives, if you will, in the halls. And then you get to a place where it's more amorphous and we have this clarity. Well, no, the university is a bigger place. And while it felt like it may have been sacrosanct, it truly isn't. And knowing where those some people truly struggle with that. And my esteemed colleagues in the last presentation talked about, if you are working at a place that you are clearly on different ends of the spectrum with regard to organizational priorities or the North Star, and you've identified that, you've got to ask yourself whether you can be part of that or you can't. Now, it may not be as, easy or as clear as the example Leonard was giving about the name, putting a Confederate general's name on. It may not be that. It may be a lot more nuanced, and a lot of times it really is more nuanced in terms of, well, and I'm going to let you do some of this later, so I'm not going to give it away, but you won't have as clear a sense a lot of times of whether your values do or don't. It's an evolutional process in which you know what North Star is, and you know whether or not you can continue to move in that direction. As somebody asked me yesterday, I think the evolution through a career, this is around 30 years for me, has been each step you are accepting both what the North Star is at your institution and whether or not you feel your skills, abilities, talents, values fit in those or in that priority structure.
Well said, Jude. Thank you. And so we've already begun talking about this. If you don't know what your organizational priorities are, here are some places, some methods to learn about those priorities. And I think there's some new ones here because you very likely, right, have a supervisor that has provided you information. Okay, this year we need to achieve this, or this year we're going to focus on this, or together let's create a program, or let's create themes, let's create a structure. Usually none of that engagement comes from the ether, right? It comes from encouragement, comes from directive, comes from advice that they have from organizational priorities. And so these here are some of the places where usually you would read messages. There would be specific documents about the organizational priorities of the institution, or the division's priorities. And so the first two elements, Board of Trustees reports and University Strategic Plan, those are going to be very broad, usually broad documents, but will mention words, sentences about what the institution is trying to achieve. And I'm one that likes to read to the detail a president's email to the community, or a Board of Trustees chair letter, poster, meeting, to see kind of what was the theme of the discussion. Since I'm not one that sits on those meetings, I want to distill a little bit and understand where the institution is going, or what are some of the problems that were discussed. And so those are documents and places that are very helpful to observe and to read, so that you can get a sense of where things are, where things are going. And as you get more specific into, a vice president of student affairs, student services unit, the letters to staff, letters to students, or even a report that you very likely contributed to with the work that your unit does, your teams do. Those will probably be focused, or will highlight elements that relate to the university's priorities. And so you understanding and reading that will clarify to you what is important, what's being highlighted. And it could also give you some advice on, okay, what may be funded this coming year, what units are going to be prioritized perhaps for hiring, or what are areas that you're lacking on, or that your unit, that your focus needs to improve on, to be able to align that. And so that, I would say, those are hard elements, right, that exist in most institutions, documents, right, or artifacts per se that can give you information. Now, there's the other side of this, which is sometimes in communications and meetings, in informal emails between senior staff, those are also transferred. And so frequently asking questions to your supervisor, whether that's a director or AVP, VP, about the importance. What is important today? What are the discussions happening right now? What are the critical issues that that you care or that you're hearing of? What's coming up, right? Because you don't want to just be ready or work in a reactive way to become better, to improve your organizations. If you can proactively look at those issues and understand what they are, perceiving what's coming. And so there's a good amount of communicating and reading in the lines and between the lines through conversation with colleagues, with your supervisor, with others in the institution. And so one other aspect too, and here, as I've described, these are very, top-down, more institutional priorities, organizational, more, I would say more structured types of priorities. Now they can, of course, become and come up, bottom up. Let's think of a couple of situations in the last few years where universities may not be, many universities not supporting, not understanding their racial inequality issues in their campuses, and students bringing that issues to the forefront and putting in the face of administration, right? The other aspect, facilities issues. If we think of various aspects in 2018 of universities being faced with multiple cases of microbial growth and mold, those are not at the top priority of the institution probably when they started semester, but they came bottom up and they became a priority. I would say those are smaller cases similar to COVID-19, right, which was a worldwide priority that ended up becoming the main priority of campuses. So both the formal and the informal and the top down and the bottom up are important to understand, and it take you to, as Jude was saying, to that concept of what is the North Star? What is the constellation surrounding the North Star that we have to be focused on?
Chris, is there, go to the next slide. Is there a way I can share my screen and
definitely.
Yeah.
Let me know when you.
Okay, go ahead. Go to your next slide. Okay. Let's go through this, and then I have a exercise.
Okay. So for example, right, the reality that we're in right now of COVID-19, we may be at different stages in the, let's call the stages in the process of reopening, recovery of universities and recovering of our own communities, right, in different stages of vaccination. Very likely most universities in your office had resources impacted by COVID-19. You may have had before that a university with a very robust plan of developing a new advising center on campus, or building a new student housing, or adjusting housing fees for different reasons, for achieving different priorities. But when COVID hit, the adjustment that campuses had to do, from large financial planning aspects to staffing aspects, right, remote versus in person, and even here, for example, here in our campuses, where we closed for most of the fall semester, the overwhelming majority of our residence halls were closed, repositioning staff to other units. And so the focus, the priority of the institution, and the priority of our office became to support the greater financial role of the institution to save and conserve resources. So all the work that we had to focus on student housing was put to the side, and became, how do we support other units? So how do we support other units with online learning? So many of my staff members went in, joined the provost office online learning unit and helped with online course delivery. And so that part of ensuring that your team can be nimble enough to support larger organizational priorities and larger organizational shifts is something that happened in this year, and that it's important to note they may not be as large as they've been this year, but they will teach us how organizationally, when finances are involved, when staffing is involved, is that we have to be attuned to how we can continue to be relevant. And hopefully, as we continue to be relevant, right, maintain alignment, reduce staff impact by furloughs, by loss of financial benefits, in the loss of employment, right, and that ensuring that we are positively benefiting the institution. So this concept of thinking about COVID and thinking about how your team is relevant and thinking about how your staff is relevant may look different between private and public. Some institutions perhaps stayed open most of the year and overdid in their, were able to overdo in their operations and their performance, but others completely on the other side and have had to significantly adapt. So this is part of our work now and continue to be part of our conversation in this focus of priorities.
I would tell you in many ways, this last 12 months is a simple microcosm of a larger, it was a quick way, a quick primer for what the skills we're going to need over the next 5 to 7 years. The speed was faster, all of that was, but the exercise is the same. And we're about to do one now. Can we change to my screen? How do we do that? Let's see. Yeah, here we go. All right, here's what I'd like to do. First of all, predicate. There's no right answers, and I'm not looking for the right answers. This is what I want to do is get you to think about this process from the eyes of senior leadership, and I'm asking you to think about it from where you're at right now. No right answers, no wrong answers. I think Chris hit it on the nose. When you know one campus, you know one campus. There are no right answers, but this should help you. Okay, so here, I'm going to put a case study up on the screen. I want everybody to consider it. I'm not going to ask for volunteers. I'm going to call on some folks and at random. And then there's some questions underneath here that I'm going to ask you to answer each. Again, no right answers. Here we go. All right. I do want to say this. I think a big mistake that people have made with COVID is even thinking that we've made all of the financial adjustments that we need to, and that we move forward from here, or that we've made all of the adjustments in terms of our organizational priority or direction, and we move forward from here. It's a giant error, and this is why. Most of schools didn't do anywhere near what was normal last year, whether we were open or not. We were open the whole year, but we didn't do anywhere close to what we normally would have done. And the faculty really didn't do anything we're close to what we would have done. So our budget needs were smaller. And now here we go into this next year, and people are going to want to do a lot of what they were before. And now we're going to feel the impact of a significant change in our financial and resource puzzle. So now we're going into this year, and here's our case study. First one, due to a huge drop in enrollment coming for this fall, off of what is projected, you are in this case study a tuition dependent institution, most are. You're brought to a meeting where you're given 2 weeks to cut 20% from your operating budget and 4 weeks to cut 20% from your compensation or personnel budget. That's heavy, isn't it? That's heavy. So what's the first thing you do? Just take 30 seconds and think about that. And I'm going to call on somebody in a minute here, 30 seconds. What's the first thing you do? Think about the timeframes, etc. Okay. Let's see. Carlos, what's the first thing you're going to do?
I'm thinking about looking at what is the things that aren't necessary. So I know one thing that came up yesterday was, as much as we hate to say it, professional development funds. At the end of the day, you don't need those. They're important, but we don't need them. So getting rid of those. If there were other things that were sort of things that don't really kind of touch the bottom line. So like if your staff plans retreats, or if they spend money in other ways that at the end of the day won't really kind of get in the way of the student experience, that's the first thing I'm looking at.
And believe me, everybody in the world would do exactly that. Now, there are two interesting things about what you said. You use the word aren't necessary, and God bless you. I think we all have, and I'm going to get to that. On our campus, the word was essential and non-essential. And what was the interesting little flavor was we're thinking about sitting at a table with our colleagues that we work with every day and trying to come up with what we can do. And at the very same time that we were doing that, we got a message from the Faculty Senate that the entire division was non-essential and that they were essential and that we should take all of their cuts. They should cut zero and we should cut double. Now, it's interesting because we are trying to come up with our own, how do we help the institution? And now at the very same time, we had to fight on a different front and say, well, it's essential, we're essential, but here's the non-essential. And that was incredibly difficult. And so our wording, as you put it, necessary, unnecessary, we essential, non-essential, that all of that becomes in play. Patrick Rosengrant, is that right? Is there,
Yes,
is there anything before, I mean, I love Carlos's answer. Is there anything before you actually dig into your expedited timeline that you might consider in this process?
I think it's first is, while it is a very quick thing you have to do, is look long-term of the entire year of things that you can get done and keep, that you need to kind of first know what you can operate with and then see what you can operate without, and then go from there, and then look at what you're currently operating at, and then try to reduce that to present items to who was asking you to do that, to show we still need to operate at this level, and this is how we can still operate and do the full job we're being asked to do with the limited amount. So being able to go to this meeting with information already presented, with your idea, and also putting in kind of some areas in which you can work with and saying, these are areas in which we need to keep this funding for us to program and do the job you're asking us to do. And this is where we can meet in the middle.
You hit upon a very interesting part to this, and that is both you and Carlos talked about figuring out that which is important and unimportant, or you said long-term effect or short-term effect, or necessary or unnecessary. Those words seem to be have fluid definition. That's the key to this, is that you might think A and somebody else thinks B. We're going to get to that in a second. All right, next question. We kind of started, but it's how are you going to go about solving just the operating budget? All right, so Patrick and Carlos have started that, but I want to actually talk about what are you going to do to solve this equation? What are the tools? Obviously, we're all different schools, so we're just talking about what are the tools that are necessary to solve this. Take 30 seconds, and then I'm going to call on some folks. I won't call on you unless I see a camera active. I don't want to assume that somebody's there that's not, or embarrass anyone. I don't want to do that. So if your camera's active, I'll call on those folks. If not, we will pass. Okay, let's see. Is it Yolande? Yolande, thank you. Can you tell me what tools you would use?
I think as I was thinking about the first question, I was thinking about, going back to the mission of the department and figuring out what are the things that are mission critical, as in like, what are the things we say we're about and the things that we say we're doing for the university? What are the things that have to remain to be able to continue to say that we're doing that even in the middle of this ongoing issue? And I think identifying those things and how we make sure we continue to do those things, even if they're at reduced capacity, will help in that beginning stage of looking at the operating budget. I think also bringing in people who are the experts on the budget. I know at some institutions you have a whole other financial part within housing that deals with all of that. And so bringing those people in and saying, okay, how have we operated in a regular year? What are the things, here are the things we've identified as mission critical. What are the budget lines associated with this thing? How do we reassess given the change in capacity? And then move from there saying, okay, if this is not mission critical, is it something that we do on a much smaller scale, or we say we're not doing this year to allow for those funds to go somewhere else? Or to be removed entirely. So those are some of the things I was thinking about.
Yes. That is spectacular. Good for you. What an awesome insight. I'm going to say something now that is very difficult for people to hear, but it is eminently true. Hear it all the way through before you make a judgment. Not everything we do is at the core of what we do. Not everything we do is at the core of what we do. Okay, so we have to look at, that does not mean that the things that aren't couldn't become so, and that the things that currently are can dissolve over time. But what it does mean, boy, what a great observation, is that we have to know what they are. We have to have a culture that discusses this regularly. We have to talk about, I call them concentric circles, what is in the core and what can we do out in those concentric circles, and are we moving things in or moving things out? Somebody else mentioned that we can't ratchet. We can't continue to do everything. And this type of process tells us we can't do everything. Remember that as we go forward. Just an awesome answer. Next part. How are you going to go about solving the personnel budget? You know this is going to require pay cuts, layoffs, benefit cuts, or all three. Totally different conversation now. Very difficult. I am sure many of you undertook some of this in the last 12 months. What tools do you need? And what priorities are you going to use? Another 15 seconds, I'm going to call on somebody. Okay, Krista.
I don't know. This was the hardest one. And
Hard.
I feel,
It's
for
hard.
me personally, I feel fortunate that my department didn't suffer from any of this in my institution. But I will say an approach that we did take that I thought was very strategic was we had several openings in the department that we chose not to fill. And instead we spread our labor out after evaluating those core things. Like we had to tell a lot of departments in the division, hey, we're not at a point where we can do these large scale programs. Like we need to shift that funding here. We need to hire student staff to work the front desk, you know, that type of stuff. And we waited until this spring actually to start filling those vacancies so we could keep our currently hired staff from having to be furloughed or laid off or anything like that. We did do benefit cuts in terms of some of those professional development fundings. We did cut those, but even then, like we've been able to register for opportunities like this, like those are still being funded because we were able, I think there was about 5 position vacancies we had, and we were able to shift those salaries to keep our currently hired staff from being furloughed or laid off. So
So excellent, excellent. And I think everybody would have to, you said several things that are all what I would hope folks would do. I would say that if you're a mid-level manager, a mid-level budget, one of the first things that you might want to do is find out, and you can go back and look at the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed and see just how different across the United States people did. Here are 3 basic questions. Is your priority, are you going to save as many people as you can? Is that the priority? Try to keep people sacrosanct as much as possible? Is that number 1? Or is it to save the functions? Or is it that you want everything to be flat, meaning 5% right across the board, figure it out? Or do you want to do prioritized functions and say, well, we're going to cut a little bit from here, more from there? Those things are a predicate. Now, I've been at an institution where it's flat, everybody figure it out. I happen to be at an institution now that was far more strategic and said, let's try to do A instead of B. Let's see, Amanda?
Krista, can I just ask a quick question? Have they given you, so we did the same thing. We have a multiple variety of positions that were vacated and redistributed. So right now my role is I have residence life, I have campus activities, I have student conduct, and I also serve as the university's Title IX coordinator, all because of how things have played out. Have they given you any indication that at some point in the future they are going to refill those positions? Or is this a long-term, it's now on your plate, it's staying on your plate, and figure out how to make it work situation?
yeah, that's a great question because it's actually one that my director asked us when we sat down to talk about budgets. We kind of took it from the perspective of, we didn't take it from like, what can we handle short term? We took it from what can we handle long term if they never come back? That sounds like a lot that you're doing, Keith. We thankfully we're all covering positions in our housing department, which is very siloed from conduct, like everywhere else. And we have already started filling those positions. So I think we only have 2 of those 5 vacancies right now.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this last piece to the next. You go ahead, go back, and then we'll come back and finish with one more exercise as we get closer to the time. Go ahead.
Perfect.
stop
This is
sharing.
great. Thank you, Jude. And in line with what Jude was saying, so as you're thinking, right, in acting, engaging with your organizational priorities, if you haven't been involved and you're beginning to be, you're part of this, you're being moved in this work, you need to make sure you know what they are, right? And you need to do an assessment, a quick self-assessment of, are you aligned? How is it that you are aligned? How is your unit aligned? And then start identifying action steps to work on that alignment. This exercise, these questions that we're asking here, you should be frequently doing this. It becomes a constant engagement of asking yourself and working with your teams to ask of your alignment. Are you not? And how do you get there, right? Are you measuring? Are you getting feedback from students, from families, from peers? Whether that's formal feedback, formal assessment, or informal by having conversations. For example, in our, when we talk about budgetary requirements, one of the people that I speak the most with is our director of the Central Budget Office of the university, and to understand, the perspectives of the university financials, financial balances, and how we are doing, how he thinks we've been doing. Are we improving? Are we not? Are there new aspects coming online in terms of our work that we have to be concerned about? And as you bring other professionals along, are you aware of how you communicate about your alignment of priorities? One aspect Jude and I talked about in our preparation for this conversation was of how important it is to inform entry-level staff and other colleagues that perhaps are not familiar with organizational priorities of the institution, of the unit, of the division, to help them explain in why we're going in this direction, what are the reasons, so that they can feel bought into where we're going, right? So not only understanding priorities, but making sure that others are part of that. And if possible, help create and inform and add to those priorities. Here at our university, we've been very fortunate the last 3 years of being part of, across campus, being part of strategic planning efforts, feedback sessions. Not all campuses have these, but if you're able to engage your staff and allow them to be part of that, is also very important. So continually asking these questions as you do your work and you become more involved with impacting institutional priorities. Quick last aspect here before we get to another exercise. As you act and as you evolve, become more involved with senior administration of the office. Remembering that it is a priority, right, to address organizational priorities and to ensure that you align, getting feedback, but also connecting, as I was giving the example of the budget office, but not only that, connecting with peers across the university that you may be able to collaborate in planning, but also in executing. I think COVID for many colleagues across higher education proved to test support and collaboration efforts across institutions. As I was giving an example of how we reposition our colleagues in the provost office in online learning, that came to be very beneficial for our staff to remain employed and to stay connected. As a supervisor and as a leader of unit, it's your responsibility, I believe, and I think that others believe too, that it's our responsibility to stay informed, to stay involved, to be educated on this. Many times your supervisor may help you with this, but if not, in the absence, you as a higher ed leader can do this and can inform your staff. And so that you continue to be a valuable team member, continue to be involved and productive. So I know Jude has another exercise and we just have 5 minutes left.
Okay, and I'm going to modify a little on the fly. I'm going to show you these discussion items to maybe guide some of your questions. And they are right along the lines of what we've been talking about. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Here are the items. What situation in COVID on your campus felt like your process was violated? What did you do about it? What would you do differently? And that mid-level role, that's where the most process gets violated. Second, how do you determine what you'll focus on in your departments and what you don't? What process are you going to use for that? That's a seminal question for you at your level. And lastly, how do you both speak to direct reports about the consequences of traumatic financial and organizational change, and also to supervisors about the potential impact? Which, if we read into that another step, you're having to execute plans that you're very unsettled by, and some might be incredibly traumatic. Some people in the chat have been mentioning some of those experiences. So we'll take your questions. These are the discussion items that we wanted to give you to discuss. Maybe you can answer those or ask some questions of us as we have a few minutes left.
I was going to say one thing that I've been sitting with and I think struggle with sometimes in mid-level management is thinking about, I've been hearing a lot of the what that people do, but not necessarily how they plan to do it with their staff. And so I think sometimes the how is just as important as the what you choose to do. And that is whenever the hard part comes in, the potential impact, ramifications, different things along those lines. And so, as far as who you're including in that process, how transparent are you about the situation that you're in? I really like this last question of trying to think about how do we navigate those relationships and those different pieces of sharing both up and down. But I think kind of going forward, I would love to hear some more people about the how, what were the challenges of having those conversations. I think someone had dropped earlier in the conversation about how they had taken on the burden of talking with their staff about potential cuts and different things along those lines to not burden others. But I think sometimes just thinking about the how as opposed to the what could also be helpful whenever thinking about some of those pieces as we sit in these positions.
John, incredibly well said. And you used the key word in there. It's funny, I just had this conversation with somebody maybe 2 or 3 days ago. Transparency. I believe that everybody in this room is smart enough to understand the same things that I can understand. I do not need to shepherd that information. I need to share it, answer your questions about it, dispel the fear that comes with it. So I 100% agree, up and down transparency. I would also say this, and I'm going to use a colloquial word, drama won't work. All right, so it needs to be even, level conversation, not that engenders more fear than it already has, more drama than it already has, but we need to work through the priorities, all of the ramifications as smooth and as level as is possible. People are going to look to you for, is your boat rocking? Because if your boat's rocking, what are you telling them to do? That they may not be used to hearing this information, but giving it to them is empowering. You're giving them a message that they matter, that this information is shared, that we're all in this together. We're going to try to get through it together. And it certainly can be a bonding experience if you do that through the trauma of it. Now, I am not saying that it isn't fearful, that it doesn't create trauma, that you're not going to have some of those conversations with people as well that help them process. I'm simply saying you use the key word, transparency, and a nice, smooth, level surface to work through these very difficult issues. Anyone else?
And Jude, thanks for sharing that. I know that at least from thinking about being transparent, almost, at least in my situation, it almost felt like it was too much. And it was almost at this level of, I'm outwardly processing this trauma that needs to stay at senior leadership. Like, I wouldn't come into a team meeting discussing, well, I hope to have everyone here next year. I'm concerned about my job because of X. I'm concerned about this, to the point where it then flipped into, we need to do this for Vanderbilt medical staff and Nashville staff so they can have a place to stay during COVID. Like, it became this thing that will always lead into a request that was being made of our staff. And so I found myself and my colleagues also at the mid-level trying to buffer the message, even though it was already getting to them. It's like buffering on the back end. And I know that that was very difficult because at one point we just didn't know, like, it would be really easy to cut us if that was one of those options. But also, like, when you're having someone who's out external processing, but also spilling their drama onto something that is unnecessary almost, like, it just doesn't make it better for anyone.
So incredibly well said. I was actually gonna add that, but decided not to. So good for you that you called it out. Yes, it is an interesting conundrum when we thirst for the information. I would never walk into a space and say, you know, half this room won't be here. I would never do such a thing. I would go into a room and say, we're faced with 20% of this and 20% of that. Here's the process and the timeline. I would do that. But to your point, it is heavy, and we do require our leaders to make these decisions. But at the same time, we reserve the right to criticize it if we're not necessarily engaged in it. And so it is this weird interplay between, oh my gosh, this is super heavy, and please tell me something. So yeah, I do recognize that's a super point, and it is a difficult dance. I will add one more thing, and I know it's gone into a financial or over a little bit. I believe in this tenet. I believe in it firmly. The real trauma is not in the cuts. The real trauma is in the falling. It's in the not knowing where the bottom is. If people know where the bottom is, they can assimilate that, you know, whether that be in terms of priorities, you're going to shift into something else. When we have a fear of, is this coming? Is there something ominous? That's where the trauma is. And so I would tell you as mid-level folks that getting ready and to communicate to others, if you can help communicate up that the trauma is in the falling and that we're creating a lack of cohesiveness and morale because of that, that can inform and help decision making. All right, so it's 1:24. I hope that Chris, great job, by the way, and
thank you.
And you're going to be going into cluster time. I know my cluster. If you please feel free to, if you want to continue to discuss or you have other questions, whatever. I thank you for your time. This is a difficult. You could probably do a half a day on just this.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to do is give you a sensibility at the mid-level of you know, what's going on up here and also what you can do in here to both develop and to inform.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you, Jude.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. We'll continue the conversation in our clusters. See you all soon.
So if you all could please join me in a round of applause for Chris and Jude. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your words of wisdom, your insights, a lot to think about, a lot of great conversation here in the chat. And as they said, it works out very well that we're diving right into cluster time so we can continue these conversations a little bit more. Just one thing to know is that the faculty kind of reviewed these sessions before the Institute, and we even acknowledge to ourselves that those of us who serve as chief housing officers, so your chief housing officers feel less empowered now than they have in years. And so we are feeling like we are mid-managers again, even in the greater enterprise, even as directors. And so everyone's kind of going through this. And so whether you're hearing that from your directors or not, that's probably some insight to know. They're probably feeling very disempowered these days about any decisions they can really make. It's just kind of the way things are right now. So housekeeping item, the sessions from yesterday, those video recordings have been posted to the events platform. So those are now available to you. So keep that in mind. And the link has been posted in the chat for the cluster times. We'll see you all in a few minutes. Thank you so much.